Think about a decision you made recently. Maybe it was something really small, like what socks you chose to wear this morning, or something massive, choosing a career or signing a lease. In that moment, it doesn't matter how big or small the choice was, you had this feeling, this really powerful gut feeling. I could have chosen differently. And that sense of agency, that feeling of being the one in charge, it might be the most basic, most human feeling we have.
It absolutely is. And that feeling, that deep personal conviction that we are the captains of our own ship, well, that's what puts us right up against one of the oldest and, frankly, thorniest questions in all of philosophy.
The big one.
The big one. It's the tension between that internal feeling of choice and the cold, hard reality of physics. Because if your brain is just a ridiculously complex collection of atoms, and those atoms have to obey the laws of physics, and every choice you make is shaped by your genes, your culture, your childhood, things you never chose, then how much freedom is actually left?
It really is the ultimate question, isn't it? Are we genuine authors of our actions? Or are we just, I don't know, sophisticated dominoes in a chain that started billions of years ago? We are diving deep into the sources today to look at the core arguments, the scientific challenges, and the big philosophical positions on this. Our mission is to figure out if we have genuine free will, or if everything we do is determined by causes that are, way beyond our control.
And this isn't just some abstract debate for a philosophy class.
Not at all. The answer to this question, it changes everything. It touches on ethics, the entire foundation of our legal system, how we think about guilt and regret, and maybe most importantly, it forces us to completely rethink how we see ourselves. Okay, let's unpack this.
First thing we have to do is be incredibly careful with our words, with our definitions.
Yeah.
Because in this debate, how you define free will at the start pretty much determines where you're going to end up.
Right, so the definition is half the battle.
It's almost the whole battle. So the core definition, the one that creates all the tension, it has three main conditions for an action to be truly free.
Okay, what are they?
First is the condition of alternate possibilities. This means you genuinely could have done something else in that exact same moment with the past being identical.
Okay, you could have picked the other pair of socks.
Exactly. The future was genuinely open. Second is the condition of authorship. You have to be the true ultimate source of the action, not just a relay station for prior causes.
The buck stops with you.
The buck stops with you. And third, which follows from the first two, is responsibility. If you could have done otherwise and you were the author, then you can be held morally responsible for what you did.
I see from the sources, though, that it's not that simple. People immediately start arguing about what that definition really means.
Immediately. You get a split. On one side, you have let's call it the strong definition. This is the one a lot of people intuitively believe. It insists that for real freedom to exist, our actions have to be fundamentally non-determined.
So there has to be a real break in the chain of cause and effect.
A genuine break. This is the definition that feels right to us, but it's also the one that science, especially neuroscience, has the biggest problem with.
And what's on the other side?
On the other side is a more modest definition, a more pragmatic one. This view tries to save the idea of freedom while still accepting that we live in a universe of cause and effect.
Okay, so how does that work?
This modest definition says free will isn't about breaking the laws of physics. It's simply the ability to act according to your own reasons, your own desires, your own character. So as long as the action comes from you, your internal thoughts, it's free. Even if your character and your thoughts were themselves caused by your genes and your past.
I see. That's a huge distinction. So the whole debate really comes down to whether you need a total break from causality or if just being in control of your own internal process is enough.
That's the pivot point of the entire conversation.
And that brings us right to the big bad of the story, the concept that really threatens that strong definition.
Yeah.
Determinism. Let's just define it simply because it's really the engine driving all the skepticism here.
Right. Determinism is the view that if you were to know the exact state of the universe at one specific moment, the position, the velocity of every single particle,
A complete snapshot.
a perfect, complete snapshot, then the laws of nature would fix exactly what happens next. The future would be, in theory, completely predictable. There's only one path forward.
The implication of that for us, for human beings, is just... it's huge, almost terrifying.
It is, because if determinism is true, then every single event, from a planet's orbit to the tiniest flicker of a human thought, has a complete and traceable history of causes. Every thought, every desire, every action is just the necessary next step in that chain.
So let's trace it back. That piece of toast you decided to eat for breakfast this morning, that choice didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Not at all. According to determinism, that choice flowed directly from the state of your brain at, say, 7 a.m. And that brain state was caused by your hunger levels, your memory of what you ate yesterday, your cultural upbringing that made you like toast.
And the way your brain was wired by every experience you've ever had.
Exactly. And you can just keep tracing it back from your preference for toast to your childhood, to your parents' genetics, to the agricultural revolution that gave us wheat, all the way back to the Big Bang. It's one single unbroken chain.
It's like the universe is just a giant game of billiards.
Uh-huh.
And every shot was determined by the very first break. And if the path of every atom, including the ones in my brain, was set in motion billions of years ago, then how could I, at the moment I reached for the toast, have truly done anything else?
You couldn't have.
And that's the core threat. That's what determinism does to the strong, traditional idea of free will. It removes the possibility of doing otherwise. Okay, so despite the almost relentless logic of that deterministic argument, that everything has a cause, which has a cause, and on, it just smashes head-on into our own lived experience of choice. Let's talk about the case for free will, the intuitive case.
Right. This is where we get into why the hard determinist view is so hard for people to actually live with. The first and most obvious argument is just the experience of deliberation. When you're faced with a choice, a real one, you feel yourself weighing the options.
You play out the scenarios in your head.
You do. You think about the consequences. You assign value to different futures. This process, it doesn't feel passive. It's not like watching a movie you know the ending to. It feels active and effortful. It feels real.
And nothing highlights that feeling better than regret. When you look back at a mistake, a big one, you don't just shrug and say, well, that was inevitable. The sting of regret comes from the conviction that a better path was available, and you feel to take it.
Exactly. That feeling is what allows us to learn and self-correct. If we really believed every mistake was just a law of physics playing out, we wouldn't agonize over them. We'd just observe them, like watching a storm roll in.
And that leads right to the biggest social structure of all, the one built entirely on this assumption: moral responsibility.
Our entire system of praise and blame, reward and punishment, everything from a bonus at work to a life sentence in prison, it all rests on the foundational belief that people could have acted differently.
Right. You don't praise your laptop for doing a calculation it was programmed to do.
And you don't blame a rock for falling when you push it, but you do blame a person for lying or for breaking a promise. We make this distinction intuitively. We blame them because we assume they had the internal power, the agency, to choose not to lie.
And the last piece of this is just that powerful inner sense of agency. We know the difference between being forced to do something, being pushed or coerced, and doing something because we want to. Even if our reasons were caused, the feeling of I am doing this versus this is being done to me is a fundamental psychological reality.
It is. It feels like I am the one starting the action, no matter where the atoms in my brain came from.
So to sum this part up, the intuitions we have about deliberation, regret, responsibility, and our own agency, they make a really powerful human case for free will. But as you said earlier, feeling something doesn't make it metaphysically true.
That is the critical pivot. Our intuitions are powerful psychological signals, but they don't, by themselves, prove that consciousness gets to step outside the physical, causal laws of the universe. The strength of these feelings just shows us why people are so resistant to a purely deterministic picture of themselves. You can't just argue away centuries of human experience.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because once we move past that internal feeling and start looking at the actual physical and neurological data, the case against that strong, uncaused free will becomes incredibly tough to ignore. Let's start with a broad idea of causal chains, and then we can get into the brain itself.
Okay, so the causal chains argument is simple on its face, but it's devastating. It just asks you to do an audit of all the ingredients that go into any choice you make. And every choice is influenced by this incredibly complex web of factors you never chose.
Like what?
Your neurochemistry at that exact moment, your blood sugar, your hormone levels, how tired you are. Then you add your cultural biases, your education level, every single memory and experience you've ever had. It's a massive database.
And this is the point that the hard determinists really hammer home.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't choose any of the ingredients that created the jigsaw.
Exactly. You didn't pick your genes. You didn't pick your family or your economic status or the country you were born in. And all those things, those unchosen factors, they built your temperament, your core values, your emotional triggers. They built your character.
So if I'm just the sum total of all those unchosen things, my biology, my environment, my history, and those things determine my character,
Hmm.
then when I think I'm making a choice, I'm not really acting independently of that history.
You're just expressing what you already are. You're like a very complex piece of software running a program written by your genes and your life experiences. When you make a decision, you're just expressing the necessary outcome of your character reacting to a specific situation. The you that chooses was not self-created. It was the inevitable result of a chain of causes stretching back before you were born.
And if that philosophical argument isn't enough, modern neuroscience comes along and tries to actually measure the problem inside our heads. Let's talk about those famous and very debated experiments, the ones looking at the readiness potential.
Right. This was a huge moment in the debate, and it really caught the public's attention. Researchers, most famously Benjamin Libet, ran these experiments where they'd have people do a simple action like flicking their wrist, and they just had to note the exact moment on a clock when they consciously decided to do it.
And what did the brain scans, the EEG, show?
They found this thing called the readiness potential. It's a consistent spike of electrical activity in the part of the brain that prepares for movement. And this spike consistently showed up a significant amount of time, often hundreds of milliseconds, before the person reported their conscious decision to move.
Wait, so the brain was already getting the process of moving started before the person's conscious mind even knew it had made a decision.
That was the explosive interpretation, yes. And later studies with better technology like fMRI have suggested that gap could be even wider. Some studies claim they can detect predictive brain activity related to simple choices up to several seconds before the person reports making the choice.
That is just fundamentally disruptive. It suggests that the feeling of "I choose now" is almost like a press release the brain sends out after the real work is already done. The feeling of choice might be a story we tell ourselves, not the actual cause of the action.
It raises the incredible possibility that our sense of free will is, at least in part, a construction, a useful illusion. It's the mind's way of creating a coherent story about behavior that was actually initiated by subconscious neural processes. Libet himself even suggested that maybe all consciousness has left is a kind of veto power, the ability to stop an action the brain has already started.
We have to be fair here. The sources are full of pushback and critiques of these experiments.
Absolutely. This is not settled science by any means. Critics point out, for one, that these experiments are about flicking a wrist. That's a very simple, arbitrary action. It's not like a complex moral decision like deciding whether to tell the truth or choosing a life partner. It's not clear these findings apply to those big choices.
And I imagine there are arguments about the timing, too. Relying on someone to report the exact moment of a decision sounds a bit fuzzy.
It is. But the biggest philosophical pushback is that maybe the readiness potential isn't the decision itself. It might just be the brain warming up, getting ready for possible action. It shows the brain is preparing, but it doesn't prove that the final conscious go signal isn't the real cause.
I see.
Still, the weight of the causal chains argument, combined with these, suggestive findings from neuroscience, it puts real pressure on anyone trying to defend that strong, non-determined version of free will.
This gives us all the context we need. We've got the tension between our gut feeling of freedom and the cold logic of causality. So now, let's dive into the three major philosophical families that try to solve this puzzle.
Okay. We'll start with the one that feels most natural to many people, libertarianism. This is the position that says, yes, that feeling of choice is real. It's a metaphysical claim that we have genuine free will, and that means our actions are not fully determined by past events.
So this is the camp that fully endorses that strong definition we talked about at the start. You could have done otherwise, and you are the ultimate author.
That's exactly right. Libertarians argue that when you face a choice between, say, A and B, both of those futures are genuinely possible until the moment you choose. The agent, the person, has a special power to originate an action, to start a new causal chain, not just be a link in an old one.
So how do they explain that? How does a person, a self, step outside the physical chain of cause and effect?
This is the tricky part. They often propose a special kind of mechanism called agent causation. The idea is that the self, or the agent, is a unique kind of substance. It's a thing that can cause events to happen, like making a choice, without itself being fully caused to do so by what came before. It's a self-starting cause.
An uncaused cause. Can you give us a metaphor for that?
Think of a train track with a switch. In a determined system, the switch operator flips the switch only because a signal told them to, and that signal is determined by the train schedule and so on. In agent causation, the operator, the agent, steps in. They decide whether the train goes left or right, And that decision isn't just an effect of the past. It's a genuinely new event created by the operator's will.
But that brings us right back to the big challenge for this view. If a choice isn't determined by my past, my character, my values, and it's also not just a random flip of a coin, then what is it? How do you define this agent causation as something different from both a machine-like process and pure chance?
And that is the absolute core problem for libertarianism, often called the intelligibility problem. Critics say, if your choice wasn't determined, but it also wasn't random, then it doesn't seem to have any explanation at all. It seems almost alien. The libertarian has to explain how the agent maintains control over an undetermined action. And that's a huge philosophical challenge that, frankly, hasn't been solved. How do we know it was me who chose, and not just randomness working through me? Okay, now let's swing to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, to hard determinism. This position takes the scientific arguments we discuss and accepts them completely. It says determinism is true, and therefore that strong kind of free will that libertarians want, it just doesn't exist.
So in this view, our whole sense of choosing, that feeling of deliberation, it's all just a sophisticated illusion, a story we tell ourselves.
It is. A powerful and maybe even a necessary illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. Hard determinists say we never ever could have done otherwise. If you could rewind the tape of the universe to 1 second before your choice and hit play again 1 billion times, you'd make the exact same choice every single time.
The implications for society are just massive here, especially for things like blame and punishment. If no one is the ultimate source of their actions, what does that do to our justice system?
It forces a complete overhaul. It requires us to abandon the idea of what philosophers call deep desert or retributive justice. Deep desert is the idea that someone deserves to suffer, to be punished, just because they chose to do wrong. The hard determinist says, since the criminal's actions were the inevitable result of their unchosen genes and their unchosen environment, you can't hold them morally responsible in that deep, ultimate way. Blaming them is like blaming a broken computer.
So if you get rid of blame and the idea that people deserve punishment, how does a hard determinist society function? How do you maintain order?
They argue that justice has to be entirely forward-looking and practical. It should only focus on consequences. So the goals of the justice system become things like rehabilitation, trying to causally change the person so they don't reoffend, or protection, simply keeping dangerous people away from society to ensure safety, or deterrence, using the punishment of one person as a causal tool to influence the behavior of others. The focus shifts completely away from moral blame and toward practical management.
It's fascinating because, on one hand, that view seems to force a kind of radical compassion. If you see everyone as a product of their conditions, it's hard to be harshly judgmental. But on the other hand, it's deeply unsettling. It feels like it removes the heroism from human achievement. If my hard work and my kindness were all just determined, what did I really do?
You have to redefine achievement. You're no longer celebrating an uncaused free choice. You're celebrating the beautiful and complex way that nature and nurture combine to produce a positive outcome through you. It's a huge challenge to our idea of the self. And that leads us perfectly to the third big camp, compatibilism. This is the position that tries to have it both ways. It wants to reconcile the scientific fact of determinism with our need for freedom and responsibility. They argue that free will and determinism are, in fact, compatible.
So this is the camp that uses that more modest definition of freedom we talked about, the one that doesn't need a break in the causal chain.
Exactly. The compatibilist argument is pretty straightforward. They say freedom is not about being magical or stepping outside of causality. Freedom is just about acting voluntarily, based on your own internal reasons and values, without anyone forcing you. As long as your action flows from your desires, it's free, even if your desires themselves were caused.
Can we use an example to contrast a free versus a non-free action for them?
Sure, a non-free action is being coerced. Someone puts a gun to your head and says, "Give me your wallet." Your action of handing it over is not free. It doesn't come from your internal character. It comes from the external threat. A free action is when you decide to donate to a charity because you value compassion. Even if your compassionate character was caused by your upbringing, the action itself is voluntary. It flows from who you are. And for the compatibilist, that's all that freedom means.
But this brings us to the biggest criticism, the one the hard determinist always brings up. If my character, my desires, my values, if they were all caused by things I didn't choose, like my genes and my environment, isn't the compatibilist just playing a word game? aren't they just redefining free to mean not being forced, which isn't what most of us mean by free will?
That is the core challenge to their view, absolutely. But they have a really important counterargument, and it all hangs on the idea of being the right kind of agent.
Hmm.
They argue that responsibility isn't about being uncaused, it's about being the kind of complex agent that is capable of responding to reasons.
What does that mean, responding to reasons?
It means you're an agent who can think, who can understand consequences, who can be influenced by praise and blame. If you tell a rock not to fall, nothing happens. It can't respond to reasons. But if you tell a rational adult, don't steal because you'll go to jail and hurt people, they can process that reason and change their behavior. The compatibilist says that the whole system of holding people responsible is valid because it's a causal tool that works on the right kind of agents.
So holding someone responsible isn't about assigning some kind of cosmic ultimate blame. It's a practical social tool to shape future behavior.
Precisely. For them, if punishing someone can causally influence them or others like them to act better in the future, then the system of responsibility is completely justified and meaningful. The focus moves away from the abstract metaphysics of the past and onto the practical social needs of the future.
Okay, before we get into the real-world stakes of all this, there's one more thing we need to clear up. It's a common idea that comes up when people hear that the universe isn't perfectly deterministic, and that's the appeal to quantum physics.
Right. This is a classic red herring in the debate, but it's an important one to address. People hear that quantum mechanics shows that events at the subatomic level are truly random, governed only by probabilities, and so they think, aha, the universe isn't determined, so there's the gap for free will.
It sounds logical on the surface. If determinism is false, then freedom must be true. But it's not that simple.
It's not that simple at all. The key problem is that randomness does not give you control. If your decision to, say, quit your job was caused by a random quantum fluctuation in a neuron in your brain, that action wasn't free. It was arbitrary. It's not something you chose or endorsed. It was just a statistical accident.
So random action isn't a free action. It's just a fluke. The libertarian needs something that is neither fully determined nor fully random.
Exactly. Strong free will requires control. Randomness is just as much an enemy of agency as strict determinism is. It doesn't solve the problem. It just replaces one problem with another.
Okay, now that we have the lay of the land, libertarianism, hard determinism, and compatibilism, let's pivot and talk about why this debate isn't just an academic exercise. Why does this matter in your everyday life?
The biggest and most immediate consequence is in our ideas about law, punishment, and desert. If you take the hard determinist view seriously, that nobody could have done otherwise, it completely upends how we approach crime and justice.
Yeah, if a crime was just the inevitable result of someone's genes and their terrible upbringing, then the idea of punishing them because they deserve it, it starts to look really cruel and illogical.
It does. Think about a judge sentencing someone. A hard determinist judge would throw out the idea of retribution entirely. Their sentence would only focus on practical, future-oriented goals.
Yeah.
How do we keep society safe from this person? What rehabilitation can we offer to change their future behavior? What message does this send to deter others? Guilt and blame are replaced by risk management.
And how would a compatibilist judge handle the same case?
The compatibilist judge would still hold the person responsible. They'd say that even if the crime was determined, the person is still the right kind of agent who understands society's rules. The punishment is still necessary, not just for deterrence, but because holding people accountable is a key causal influence that maintains the social contract. They might see the bad upbringing as a mitigating factor, but not as something that erases responsibility altogether.
The difference there is huge. One looks only to the future. The other tries to balance the future with some sense of accountability for the past.
It's the difference between seeing a criminal as a broken machine that needs to be fixed, or as a moral agent who made a wrong choice and needs correction.
Let's get even more personal. What about regret? We said it's one of the strongest feelings that makes us believe in free will. If everything is caused, is regret meaningless?
It's a great question, and the sources are clear that even in a determined world, regret is still incredibly meaningful. It's not just pointless suffering. Regret is a necessary psychological process. It's the brain's mechanism for running a postmortem on a bad decision. That painful feeling is what forces us to learn, to reevaluate our priorities, and to recalibrate our decision-making for the future.
So the feeling of regret is itself a determined event. but its function is to cause better determined events down the road.
Precisely. And on top of that, understanding deep causality can actually be a source of great compassion. When you really see that people's bad actions often flow from conditions they never chose, poverty, trauma, mental illness, it becomes a lot harder to be harshly judgmental. You focus more on fixing the conditions.
But there has to be a balance, right? Especially with personal growth. If free will is an illusion, what's the point of trying to improve yourself? Why go to therapy or try to build a new habit? Why make the effort?
That's the classic why bother question. And the answer, even from a hard determinist, is that the effort is the causal mechanism. You're not just a rock sitting there while the universe happens to you. You are an active part of the causal web. Your effort, your decision to go to therapy, your struggle to build that new habit, those are themselves determined events, yes, but they are the necessary determined events that lead to the improved outcome.
So the effort matters because it's the link in the chain that causes the change.
It is the crucial causal link. Your intention and your effort are real powerful forces in the world, regardless of where they ultimately came from.
So what does this all mean? We've gone through the big three philosophies, we've seen the science and the intuition. Since this debate is obviously not settled, the sources seem to suggest a kind of practical stance for how to live with this massive question.
They do. And the first part of that stance is to actively recognize causality in your daily life. This means really internalizing that our choices and everyone else's are deeply shaped by things like biology, environment, and pure luck.
And doing that can be a huge relief. It helps you be less judgmental of others, and maybe more importantly, less hard on yourself when you fail. You start to see behavior as flowing from conditions, not just from some mysterious failure of will.
At the same time, the second part is to hold on to agency in practice. Within whatever constraints we have, we still experience the process of thinking, planning, and deciding. And we have to take that process seriously. We can and should work to build better habits and be better people. That effort matters. Even if it's cause, it's our effort that matters.
And the third practical step is to use responsibility constructively. So shift the focus away from this idea of ultimate blame as if people were little gods who failed, and instead use responsibility as a tool, as a feedback system.
Exactly. A tool to encourage growth, to protect society, and to focus our energy on building better environments, better schools, safer communities, healthier economies that causally influence people toward better outcomes. It moves the focus from fixing individual souls to fixing the systems we all live in.
And the final piece of advice is just to stay humble about the metaphysics.
Yes. We simply don't have the final answer on how consciousness, the brain, and causality all fit together. We have to act with the knowledge we have. And as one philosopher put it, we should live as if we are free because we are in no position to prove that we are not.
So we act as responsible people, making choices and trying to do good, while also recognizing the deep and complex causes that made us who we are.
It's a balancing act. So to recap, we've looked at the three big families. Libertarianism, which holds out for a truly uncaused choice. Hard determinism, which says that's an illusion in a causal universe. And compatibilism, which tries to redefine freedom to make it work with determinism. It's a debate that's still raging, fueled by our deepest intuitions on one side and some hard scientific realities on the other. There's no easy answer.
And here is the final thought for you to take away as you go about your day and face your next choice, big or small. Whether or not we ever solve the ultimate metaphysical puzzle of free will, we are all forced by the nature of our own minds to live with the experience of making decisions. We feel deliberation, we feel effort, we feel regret. And that process of choosing, that act of reflection, is itself a real and powerful force in the world. And how seriously you take that process is what will ultimately shape the person you become and the world you help create.